Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 46 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So today we're winding up our special two-part discussion for the 1-year anniversary of the podcast, and I asked my friend Karen Millsap to return once again to interview me on my own show. Just like last week. Last week was part 1, and I had so much fun talking with her, especially this week, reflecting on how and why I started the podcast, and also thinking about some of the main lessons that I've learned from my guests. I had fun talking to her both weeks, actually, but then last week was more on my story and how I became a widowed parent, and our family's experience with my husband's cancer. And then this week we get more into forward-looking. Why did I start the podcast? How did I learn what I needed to know to create and run a podcast? We talked about getting over the question of why me? Like, why does anybody want to listen to me on a podcast about widowed parents? And that was, that was a tough one to get over because I'm not the expert. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a grief expert. And I have learned a tremendous amount from my guests over the past year. Anyway, I'll get more into that, talking about that on the show, cause that was a big blocker in getting started. We talked about what's been the most fun, and also what's been the hardest. We went into quite a bit of depth of what I've learned from some of my guests on the podcast. So, week to week, it's a different topic, it's a different guest, it's a different piece of the puzzle, if you will. And one of the things that I don't get to do so much week to week is to step back and draw out some of the themes or some of the key learnings and kind of organize what I'm learning in some fashion. And so I really wanted to take this opportunity of the 1-year anniversary to do that sort of reflection and to start to share that with you guys. And we finished up by talking about what I'm looking forward to over the next year. So lots of things going on, and a couple of books I'm working on and things, so we talked about that too. Anyway, huge thanks to Karen for taking the mic again this week for part 2, helping me to reflect on my journey and reflect on the things that I've learned. And I hope you enjoy our discussion.
Hey, Jenny. Well, welcome back to your podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be back here. I had so much fun doing last week's show, so thank you for coming back again.
Absolutely. Well, it's like the second part of the novel, right? So we were talking about your past, which was awesome. And if anybody missed that, make sure you go back and check it out. But we were talking about how you got to this point, the point where we have all met you, as the host of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So let's talk about the podcast. First, why? Why did you decide to do this?
Yeah, that's such a good question. What it came down to me was I really felt like there was a gap in, the answer to the question, okay, how do I be a widowed parent, right? I have a new role now, a new job, a new task, a new challenge. How do I do this? And maybe I'm weird. I don't know. I tend to go looking for the book that will kind of give me the landscape of whatever it is that I'm trying to learn about.
You know why? Because they ruined us with that book, What to Expect When You're Expecting. And now we feel like there's a guidebook for everything. They ruined us.
Right. Yeah. Actually, that is funny because I was actually thinking of this as like what to expect when the other parent dies. Right? Like,
Genius.
Yeah. But nobody has written that. Right? And so I'm like, where is that book, right? I need that book. Oh, okay, that book isn't out there. By the way, there are lots of good books and resources on different pieces of all these things. But where's the landscape? Where's that big picture? What's going to tell me what needs to be on my radar screen? What should I be thinking about? What are the issues I might be facing now or later in this whole new deal? And so And then the other thing was I was looking at, I think there's a lot of really good work being done, first of all, for adults, for widows themselves in their own, and I'm not saying it's easy, of course. I'm just saying there are people doing really good work to help people with that piece. You, for example, you're doing really good work in that space. There are people who've written books. There is Camp Widow, who's in Soaring Spirits, who is doing good work, and there's the individual therapists. I didn't feel like there was a huge gap in what was being covered there. And as far as children's grief, there are centers who are doing, there are grief centers in many cities. There's Camp Aaron. There's a lot of, peer support groups. There's really good stuff. And I still felt like, as a parent, I felt kind of lost, right? Like, even if my kid was going to a therapist every week and going to a peer grief group once or twice a month and going to Camp Aaron for 3 days in the summer, and that would be a lot of grief work, by the way, there's still like 300 other days in the year where it all comes down to me as far as figuring out, right, what do I do? Mm-hmm. And that's where I just felt like there was a gap. And I guess I figured out that in looking for those answers for myself, I could also share what I was learning with other widowed parents.
Because I think we don't realize how common it is.
Yeah, which, yes, is a really good point. And I recently talked to Judy's House, which is in Denver, and they are a grief program there. They also have a research arm, which does a whole bunch of stuff, including they've done this thing they call the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model. And we go deep on that a couple episodes back if anybody's interested in listening. But the kind of bottom line number that they came up with, and this is a U.S. figure, U.S. nationwide, 1 in 14 kids, by the time they turn 18, 1 in 14 kids will have lost a parent or a sibling.
That's incredible. Like, that is not a 1 in 1,000 or even 1 in 100. I mean,
yeah, I know. And that's just an immediate family member. That's not all the other types of loss, right? That's just that very close parent or sibling. And that shocked me. And, I think about growing up, I can't think of anybody that I knew.
Me neither.
Who was growing up with a parent who had died. And maybe there was somebody that I wasn't aware of, but I don't think so. I
mean, I don't even think I picked up as a kid on the Disney movies how almost every single Disney movie, one parent has died.
Yeah.
There's only 3 that have both parents. It's Hercules, Mulan, and now the last one is, I'm forgetting.
Oh, is the new one Moana?
That would be added to it, but I heard this before Moana was out.
Okay.
Yeah. I forget what it was. No. Anyway, but the point is, it's more common than we think.
Yeah. Well,
so we need to talk about it.
And when I think about it now, I mean, really, I know a sadly high number of widowed parents in my own personal circles, in addition to all the people I've met, of course, through the podcast and related. But just, I mean, okay, so across the street from me, 2 doors down from me, around the corner from me, around the other corner from me, all widowed with kids in grade school and high school. Plus another handful that are within a 15-minute drive. And these are all people in my, neighborhood or school circles, personal circles. And I just think it's crazy. But I didn't realize until I was in this position how common, unfortunately, it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. I mean, okay. So you're like, hey, insert Jenny. I have an ambitious heart. I am going to shed light on this. But podcasting was new to you. This wasn't something that you were probably even thinking about, beforehand. So how did you learn what you needed to get the show running? Yeah, you're right. It was absolutely new to me. And I've learned, so many things. I did work in tech for 20 years before this, for a large tech company. By the way, nothing
that would relate practically to the tech things I'm doing now, right?
It's just that technology didn't scare you off.
Yes, and I think that's the most important element of it. Yeah, because that was a large corporation working on internal financial systems, right? So totally different ballgame. This is I do the editing, I do the social media, I had some help initially building the website, but since then I do all the website stuff myself, with the graphics, everything. So a few things, I guess. The first thing I had to do, honestly, was kind of get over the question of why me? Like, why should I start this podcast? Even though I knew that on one level it made sense, like why I'm not a therapist, I'm not an expert in grief, I'm not, like, why are people going to want to listen to a podcast from me on widowed parenting? And people would tell me, well, you have your story, you have your own experience, and there's value in that. And I said, yeah, I get it, but I still not quite seeing how this hangs together. And that was really stopping me from doing the things I needed to do to move forward. And I had done some stuff, like I got a podcast artwork, like the easy stuff, right? but the really, approaching guests and thinking about how to put this together. And I finally, I realized that I was looking at it almost completely backwards. Like, I didn't need to try, since I wasn't the expert, I didn't need to try to be the expert or try to pretend to be something that I wasn't. That I instead could put myself in the role of my listeners, kind of stand in for them, if you will, and ask questions on their behalf of the various experts. And that's why I do an interview show. Yep. Because each week sense. I can, and because there are people, like I said, who are doing excellent, whether they run a grief center in a city, whether they have written a book about this topic or that topic that's relevant to my listeners and to myself, whether they're a therapist who's worked, and can speak about children's development and, parenting issues and whatnot. Those are the experts. And because of my story, I can think about what questions to ask them that then make that accessible so that my listeners don't have to try to go interview all these people themselves, right? That's too big of a project. But I can, if I'm having these discussions, I can record them and I can put them up on a, hosting platform and put it out in the world, and people seem to be responding to that. Did
you ever think when you started to shift your mindset from, okay, who am I? Like, I'm not an expert, to, well, no, I'm just the one who's asking the questions. At any time during that, did you think to yourself, and wow, this is actually going to help my healing because I'm going to get all of my questions answered too?
Oh, I think that all the time. Yeah. Yes. And I can, when I'm asking questions of people, sometimes I can say, one of the things that I hear from widowed parents that they struggle with is X or Y or Z, and then ask them about that. And sometimes I'm asking because I did hear it from widowed parents that I talked to. And sometimes I'm asking because I'm struggling with it. And I know if I am, that somebody else is too, right? So yeah, it's totally, and I can read books that I think are going to be kind of double, killing two birds with one stone, right? A book that might be useful for me, myself, and my family. And then I'm like, hey, this would make a really great topic for the podcast because I know other people have questions on this, or they're struggling with this, or they would like this resource or this book. So let me see if I can approach this person and talk to them and put it on the podcast. And more often than not, people have been very willing to, to share and to talk to my listeners, which has just been fantastic.
Yeah, because it's a fantastic show. I mean, come on, who would not want to be on here? It's so good. It's so good.
The other part of your question, you're asking, so how did I learn, I guess, all these things? So I taking the long way around, I guess, to answering your question. I listened to a fair amount of podcasts, and I tried to kind of break down some of them and think about, like, how do they format? Like, they have an intro, and they have music, and then they have a little recording from the host, and then they, kind of break down. And I took 2 or 3 podcasts that I liked, because of course there's zillions of podcasts, and I'm like, I can't look at all these. So I picked a few that I liked, and then thought about what would work for this format. But the other thing I did is I thought, I'm going to be interviewing people, and I've never interviewed anybody, right? and I didn't want to just get on a recording and say, hey, tell me about yourself. And just kind of, wander all over the place and then end up an hour later like, okay, thanks, that was interesting, right? And then, but kind of not have a sense of coherence or a through line or any kind of right? And so I thought, well, who's the best interviewer that I can think of? And of course I thought of Terry Gross from Fresh Air. It's like, well, okay, she's obviously top of her game. So I Googled how to interview like Terry Gross.
Yes.
And I found two things. Somebody had written, I think it was like a LinkedIn, post or something where they had kind of analyzed what they thought she did well. So I read that. And then I read it was a lengthy, I think it was a New York Times profile, something like that, a profile of her life and her work. And it was an interview with her. So she had a lot of content in there about why she approaches things the way she does, why she asks things the way she does. And so that was really helpful to think about. Obviously, I'm nowhere near, what Terry Gross is doing. I figured
on your way, Jenny.
Well, I figured if I can even do a few of the things she's doing, incorporate some of that thinking and, thought process into it, that would be helpful. And the other thing is I read a book about storytelling from a guy who is a Moth Story Slam champion or something. I don't know what the right words are, but like a big storyteller dude who's gotten all these awards. And I studied kind of the structure of a story and how you put together a talk that's a story versus a talk that's something else. Because a lot of the interviews that I do, I'm kind of helping a person tell their story. And so I've thought about it in that aspect and how to kind of structure the story that way. So that's been really helpful. And then, there's all the other pieces like how to edit. And I just kind of Google things and learn and ask people questions. And
anybody who's an entrepreneur, we just have to like tell them you can figure it out. Even if you don't know how to start it, whether it's you starting a podcast or a business or what have you, the resources and the knowledge are out there. Wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, totally. And that's where also, I think like you said before, being in tech made me, I think, not afraid to try those things or to go look
to
for
learn.
Those things.
Yeah,
Exactly. And I learned a tremendous amount. My friend Robbie Samuels has a podcast. And he has a mastermind that I was in, and also a mastermind with Dory Clark, which is really a fantastic group of people. And a lot of those people are in other fields, business and things. But I learn a lot from watching them, what they're doing in their fields, and then apply it in this field too, which is, which has been helpful. And I think it's, I come at this from a different perspective than somebody who's been in, counseling or grief work for a long time. So I don't know what I don't know. So I take good ideas wherever I can find them, and I just try to incorporate them.
Absolutely. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. So what would you say, I guess, what do you love most? Like, I was going to say, what has been the easiest part, but I'm not even going to go there because once you learn something, you're like, I got that down. But so what do you enjoy most about hosting?
Yeah, I think it's the idea trading, talking about ideas with people and really being able to dive deep. I feel like it's something that maybe has been missing from my life for a while, right? When you get involved in a corporate job and you're very focused on your job, and when you have small children, you don't have a lot of time to do outside reading. And I don't think I read a book for, I don't know, maybe 20 years is an exaggeration, but really, right? I mean, it was a period of time when I wasn't doing a lot of stuff that was outside what had to get done, whether it was at home or at work, right? And so now I feel like my mind is opening up to all of these ideas, and then I can read about them and learn about them, and then talk to the people who are writing these books. And I don't know, I just, and I think part of this maybe what surprised me too, how much I would enjoy the interviewing. I remember the very first interview I did, I was trying to interview a friend of mine first. She's a widowed parent, and I actually interviewed her. It turned out to be episode 3. I thought, well, that would be a good interview to start with because I know her. And so, I don't know, if everything gets screwed up, I could probably ask her to do it again if I lose the recording or, whatever. But at just a fluke of the calendar and the way it got scheduled, my very first interview was with a complete stranger, somebody I had met on Instagram, Kendra Zaru. She's out in California. And we had such a good discussion. I totally lost track of time. I realized after that interview that I had to like make a note of the time because we were talking and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, have we been talking for 20 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes, right? And we got to the end of the discussion and it was so great. And I just was so energized afterwards. Mm-hmm. And then it turned out I interviewed my friend then later the same day. First two interviews all in the same day. And that was such a high feeling, of like, wow, like I really love talking to people and learning from them and learning for myself and learning for my listeners. And
I think that's how we know that we're fulfilling our purpose or like that our soul is set on fire when whatever the activity is, even if it's work, especially if it's work, but it gives us energy. Yeah. If we get energy from just doing the thing, then we should feel pretty confident that we are in our flow.
Yeah. Yeah. Such a good point. And I read that book too. What's it called? Finding Flow, I think.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah. Haley Csikszentmihalyi, I think is how you pronounce it. Finding Flow. And it's, and that was one of the books I read early on. It's not related to the podcast exactly, but it's like, how do you figure out like what you should be doing and that sense of energy? Yeah, and the funny thing is, I was thinking about this the other day too. Like, I can still remember a time in high school, even in college, when I didn't want to raise my hand in class to talk. And I felt like I had to figure out like the perfect thing that I was going to say before I could raise my hand. And then I'd finally get it all sorted out, what words I wanted to use, whatever. And then I'd raise my hand. But then the conversation would have moved on. Right? So that's kind of hard. And so if you had told me back then, like, oh, in 20 or 30 years or however many years, you're going to have this podcast and be talking to people and going with the flow of the conversation. I mean, even though I do a lot of preparation before the interview, and even though I have a good sense of what questions I want to ask, it always adapts on the fly. Always,
right. It has to. It has to be fluid, right? With a conversation. Yep.
Exactly. Because I don't want to get on with somebody and be like, okay, here are your questions. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah. Thank you. Goodbye. Right?
And so, you might miss something in the present.
Yeah. Things like they say something, which then I want to, follow up on that. Or even, they say something that I was planning to ask later. And so then either I cut that out or I follow up on it now and then don't come back. So I guess it does kind of surprise me how much I love it and that it's not freaking me out, if that makes sense, based absolutely. On, the past. Jenny
1.0, 2.0, whatever. Yeah. Now you're 3.0. That's how I feel.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what's been the hardest part then?
Yeah, well, I think juggling everything. I mean, even right now, this week, I feel I've got so many balls in the air. And, because I am doing it all myself, which means I'm trying to pay attention at the same time to the strategic level and the operational level and all the way down to like, okay, now I need to create the graphic for this episode and now I need to import the file and do the editing, right? But then I don't want to lose sight of the strategic, of the bigger picture, like where am I going with this and what topics haven't I covered and what types of guests should I look for next? And it's easy to get lost, in the details of the day-to-day producing a show every week and lose sight, like maybe it would be helpful to do some writing to go along with this and, and then making time for that. And that's actually one of the reasons why in August, I actually, I took an August break and I said, you know what, I'm clearing my calendar of producing a weekly show because even though I'd like to think that I could contain it to X number of hours per week and then carve out other time for writing, it's also kind of a mental bandwidth problem.
Absolutely. I don't know who this will help, but I know it helped me. I was talking to my dad And I was telling him, man, I just feel like a basket case. Like my head is all over, same thing. I'm thinking about where I want to go, what I should do next, but then I have everything that's demanding my attention in the day. And so he said, well, I want you to remember this. When you go to a normal job where you report to, an organization, a manager, all those things, you're showing up and you're doing a job where they have already outlined what they need you to do. They say you do this, you do it at this time and that's like they give you basically your marching orders. My dad was in the Air Force. And so he said, but when you are your own boss, then you have to be the visionary and the doer. Yes. And that's why you feel like you're going crazy, because you literally have to live in that space where you have to project what things are to come for that success or for to reach that goal or that milestone, but you also have to get it done. Yeah. So you feel like you're on a roller coaster. And then to piggyback off that, I said one time to my friend, she said, how you doing? I said, oh, I'm on a roller coaster. She said, better a roller coaster than a merry-go-round. I was like, wow, that is knowledge right there. So needless to say, I have some pretty wise people around me, but it's true. Like, when you're fully invested in your thing, you do have to go from 30,000 feet down to actually, planting the seeds.
Yeah. And it's hard to operate on both of those levels at the same time, or to effectively flip back and forth, I guess, between them without, I find it easy to get either lost in the day-to-day and lose sight of the bigger picture, or spend all my time dreaming and planning about the big picture stuff and then not actually get anything done. Right. Yep.
That's when it's time to call in the troops, I guess, when we start still to build the team.
Yeah.
So as you're thinking about all of the things that you've learned and all of the experiences, what are some of the biggest lessons that stick out from you or for you from your guests?
Yeah, I've learned so many things from my guests, and I feel like I'm lucky to be in this position that I can talk to all of them. One of the things that I learned, which I think is interesting, this idea that you don't have to have all the answers. And I remember I was talking to the folks over at Hamilton's Academy of Grief and Loss, Sasha Mudloff and Buffy Peters, and I think that Sasha was the one who said this, that it's perfectly okay to say to your kids, I don't know. And I think in the past I've maybe tried to feel like if I didn't know the answer, that I didn't want to talk about something, or I had to wait maybe until I had answers, or maybe make up an answer. I don't, but this idea that it's okay to say I don't know and I will find out, or I don't know and let's find out together, if it's something you can read a book about or Google. Or sometimes it's a question that's like, why did Dad have to die? And I don't know, and it's not something I can Google, right? And that it's okay to say, I don't know, and it sucks. And right? It's not fair. And there isn't an answer, so I don't have to try to make an answer out of it, if that makes sense.
It definitely makes sense. My son had a breakdown a couple of weeks ago, and his question was, why would the bad man kill my dad? Like, why? There has to be a reason, right?
Right. And you can't answer that.
I know.
Yeah.
And it's tough.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah. And I really liked, when I talked with those folks, they had so many interesting things. And actually, they've got a really good resource library that I want to mention for listeners. They've got all these, it's free, like 1 and 2 page sheets on different topics, grief by age group, how to talk to kids about suicide, how to talk to kids about grief if they're, really little, or what are the needs of teenagers. Lots of really good. Oh, and this is another one of those questions. They've got one that's how to talk to kids about cremation.
Wow. You got to link that down in the show notes, because I need that.
Yeah, it was, and I read it, and it was a hard one. It was like how to explain it, like, because when at a certain age, kids are going to be like, well, what does that mean? What is cremation? What exactly do they do? Where's the body? How does this work? And you don't really want to read that stuff, but if you've got a kid asking about it, it's an important resource, I think. So I learned a lot from them. Another thing that I learned, one of the questions I hear a lot, and I struggle with myself, is how do I know if something is a grief issue or a normal teenage issue or a normal kid issue, right? Like,
mood swings.
Yeah, or like, I read, so Dr. Lisa D'Amour has this book called Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood. Fascinating book. In fact, one of my widow friends recommended it to me because someone had recommended it to her. And I just thought, I was obviously a teenage girl once myself, but I guess I don't remember, or I didn't have the developmental insight at the time to understand like what teenagers, and in her case, particularly girls she writes about, are going through as they transition from being a child to being an adult. That everybody knows, the body changes and hormones and all that, but the brain development aspects of it are huge. And so I asked her if you have a kid who's 12 or 13 and they're locking themselves in their room and they don't want to talk to you and they say, go away. And, how do you know if that is because kids who are 12 and 13, I mean, part of what they're trying to do developmentally is separate from their parents. And in quote unquote normal teenage behavior, you start to see that behavior, right? Closing the door. I don't want to talk to you, starting to separate. Well, how do you know if your kid is doing that or if they're closing the door and not wanting to talk to you because they're depressed and they're isolating and there's something else going on that's not developmentally appropriate activity. It's more like an indication of a problem. The behavior might look the exact same, closing the door and refusing to talk. How do you know what to make of that? And so I asked her that when I interviewed her, and she said she suggested a kind of a handy yardstick or a guidepost, I guess. In her book, she talks about these 7 different developmental strands that basically human beings, need to develop socially, academically, in terms of self-care, in terms of emotional regulation, physically. There's like 7 different, strands along which a human being has to develop to move into adulthood. And so she says, if your kid's growth and development is stalling on one or more of those areas, then it might be an indication that there's a problem that you need to look further at or get professional help or consider whether there might be something else happening versus, if the kid seems to be developing satisfactorily along these 7 different strands and they're closing themselves in their room, then yeah, it's probably just developmentally normal and not something to be concerned about. I thought that was really, really interesting. And I thought, I just learned so much from reading the book and talking to her about what that development looks like. And it's something that, with my kids being 13 and 15 now, it's something that's, obviously an active topic for me.
That's so good. I mean, I think it's just helpful to know. Yeah. Again, as we were talking about earlier, there's no guidebook for parenting in general.
Yeah.
But that sounds pretty close to at least understanding your kids' hormones.
Yeah, exactly. I've learned so many other things. Do we have time? I think we have time to get into them here. Well, let's see. So, okay. So some of the most interesting, I think, interviews that I've done have been with people who are adults now, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And when they were young, they lost one of their parents. Maybe they were...
When we were talking earlier about like knowing widow parents, I would say that to the same thing earlier. I didn't know about kids when I was that age, but now I'm hearing about all of these adults who, and I'm like, how did I not know that when I was a kid when it actually happened?
Right, because they might be adults that are your age, and so back then, they had lost a parent, but I guess we didn't happen to come across them, or we didn't know because people didn't talk about it as much. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know, but it's fascinating, I think, too. And I'm so grateful that some of them have been willing to share their stories. Because to hear their perspective and their reflections on what it's like to lose a parent when you're 3 or 11 or 19, it's not like it's going to tell me exactly what my kids are going to go through, because obviously everybody's journey is different and everybody has a different experience. But it gives me an awful lot to think about. And it gives me things to maybe pay attention to, puts things on my radar screen that maybe weren't already on my radar screen, that I should just try to be a little aware and notice if I see this or that, based on what I've learned from these people. And one of the guys I interviewed, his name is Austin Shoecraft, and he's in his mid-20s now, and he lost his dad when he was 11. He talked about this organization called the Dinner Party that he's been involved in, which is a group for young adults, I think mostly in their 20s and 30s. Most of them, I think, have lost a parent. I do think that if you've lost a sibling or some other losses, it's for that too. Anyway, right before I interviewed him, he went to his dinner party group meeting. And so basically it's a small group, a half dozen or dozen people, and they've all had a major loss at an early age. And so he actually took some questions that I posed to him, to his group, and posed them for discussion, and then kind of came back and reported, in a summary sense of kind of some of the themes. And one of the things that he said that his group had, a theme that kind of emerged was the need that they wished their surviving parent had taken better care of themselves and their own grief upon losing their spouse. Because now these young adults who are in their 20s and 30s, in some cases, were taking care of their surviving parent who never really had figured out how to integrate that loss and how to, continue living in a healthy way for whatever reason. I mean, you expect that when you're reaching older middle age, then you be involved in helping your elderly parents. But these were people who were 20 and 30 with, 50-year-old parents that they were really having to care for, some of them pretty significantly. Mm-hmm. And it was something that I hadn't thought of. And it was, I think, a illuminating perspective that taking care of myself is important for myself, and so that I don't burden my kids with taking care of me, way before, maybe when I'm 95, okay, but I don't want them to be taking care of me when they're 22 and I'm whatever I'll be at that point,
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many things to unpack there, but I just had a conversation about this with a woman yesterday her mom became widowed when she was 39. She was 11 at the time when her stepfather died. Mm-hmm. And she said, looking back, I can see that was the onset of her depression. And she never took care of herself because she just felt like, I got to take care of the kids. I have to go to work. She said, but there were these moments that I remembered, her stress bubbling over or something happening, but she's like, but it's because she was distraught and depressed and grieving and was never able to process it correctly. So it was coming out in other ways. Mm-hmm. And now, years later, she has a daughter of her own in college, right? So this is years later. She says, now she is trying to undo all of those years of depression because she realizes. And I feel like, up until now, self-care has kind of been seen very selfish, as a selfish act. But I feel like we are in the midst of this change that is going to impact the next generation through the way that we care for ourselves, and also because we're setting the example for them. So yes, I can see how that is a thing, especially for 20-something-year-olds or 30-year-olds who their parents probably were not given the tools to practice self-care, nor was it really, enforced. Like, no, go take care of yourself. No, you should, be conscious of what you're putting in your body, right? Or all those things that now you can find a tip sheet for in a matter of moments on Pinterest,
Yeah. Well, so this reminds me actually of something that I learned from you when I interviewed you. That this idea that I am really setting an example for my kids by how I choose to live after loss. And I remember you said something like, because you were really struggling and you realized one day that
I had to put my oxygen mask on first.
Yeah. And that you were really, how you handled this was really going to affect your son's future and his character. And you said something like, if he loses me too, and not like losing you, but like in effect, if you didn't, get things together, he was going to kind of in effect lose both of his parents. And that would be doubly tragic.
And I wasn't going to let that be his story. That was my no, I refuse to let that be his story because I wanted to give up. Like, that's a real thing. I feel like we glaze over that, but that overwhelm of becoming a single widowed parent is a lot. And you get to the point where you feel like, I don't know if I have it in me to keep going. I don't know if I can do this. And you do it, but you kind of do it on autopilot. But yeah, it was just like, no, I refuse to walk through this life, a zombie,
right,
and not be fully present for my kiddo. He doesn't deserve that.
Yeah, he already lost his father. And so you didn't want him, I mean, I guess I'm putting words in your mouth, but to have a mother that was anything less than fully present and awesome for him.
That's right. Whole and happy. That was my goal. I just want to be whole and happy and create that space for him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So thank you for teaching me about that when we
talked. Of course, it's an all.
Yeah. And then, it kind of reminds me actually a little bit, I talked with Tracy Biebel, really interesting discussion. She's a social worker and a parenting coach. And the question really was around moms who are raising boys and dads who are raising girls post-loss, and particularly as they get to puberty and teenage years. But and that was fascinating. And an interesting piece came up. One of the things I learned from her was that, like, it's not my kid's job to manage my emotions. Mm-hmm. And it's a theme that I've been reading in different places, this idea that, whatever circumstances happen, it's the individual person's job to manage how they are going to respond. Even if this totally sucks, whatever this is, right? That doesn't necessarily have to dictate how I respond.
Yes, that is the stance that I live on, Jenny. You know it. Yes.
Yeah. And so Tracy gave a really good example, because she said something about that, and I said, okay, let's dig deep. Like, what do you mean? Can you give me an example? Like, what does that look like in practice with our kids? And she said, and I love this. She said, let's say you have a really hard day at work, and you come home and you're like, oh man, I had a really hard day at work, and my boss was mean, and my colleague didn't do what they were supposed to do, and whatever. And so then if you say to your kids, so now you have to be nice to me, right? Then you're kind of putting that burden on them, like, because I had a lousy day, now you have to somehow, like, be nice so you don't make me more upset, or something, like putting that.
Or another way that you could say that is like, or can you not give me a hard time? Or can you, like, it's a different way of saying it, but it's, again.
Well, and so what she suggested, so I said, so what would you do instead? Like, what's the better way to, right? So she said, well, it's totally okay to share, like, guys, I had a lousy day, this happened and this happened. But then to follow it with, I'm just letting you know, I'm managing it. It's fine. I don't need you to do anything or whatever, but I'm sure I'm not doing justice to the way she articulated this. But the point being, like, because it is useful to have your kids see you managing difficult emotions, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You had a difficult time at work. It's not bad to share that. And then you want them to see that, and you are coping with it. Not, I had a bad day, and so now I'm going to make it your problem by, interacting with you in some way that makes it your problem, instead of just sharing where I'm at and then sharing that I'm coping, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. If I could share a lesson that I think would be helpful, because, we do get the question a lot when somebody is referring a friend to you who's a widowed parent. They always want to ask you, how do I help my kids grieve? Right? Don't you get that a lot? And so it's like, okay, well, my suggestion to them is always, well, you have to grieve in order to be the example, which we've just talked about. We kind of covered that. And so the other day, Caleb was hitting a wall in his homework, and he was crying because it wasn't coming easy to him. Bright kid, but if it doesn't come easy, he's an emotional wreck. And I could see myself in him. So anyway, we were working through it, and we have a lot of mindset conversations. Fast forward an hour, I'm frustrated about something that I'm writing, and I close my laptop and I sit there and I'm rubbing my temples on my head. And he said, Mom, what's wrong? And I said, I'm just feeling really frustrated. I can't get these words out. And he said, okay, well, remember how we were talking about mindset? He was like, right now, you're over here, you're stressed. He was like, why don't if you walk over here? Like, he just walked through it. And it's such a great example, right? Is if we show them that, yes, I do feel stressed, I do feel overwhelmed, or what have you, but you're showing that you're managing it in a healthy way. That gives them the tools more than you just reading a book and telling them how they should engage with their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
You're the living example.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah.
All right. So I think we have time for one more, because I have a couple more questions for you.
Okay. Well, let's see here. Okay. So I didn't realize until I started talking to people that there's such a thing as traumatic grief. That there's like regular grief, and I'm sure that's not the right word. Like, I think they call it adaptive grief, or I don't know, let's just say grief. But then there's traumatic grief. And this whole trauma thing. And I was talking to Lane Pease at Kate's Club, and she had so many interesting things to say. And she's the first one who mentioned this to me. And this idea that if somebody is having a trauma reaction to the loss, that those trauma reactions actually interfere with their ability to do healthy grieving tasks or healthy grieving, outlooks or whatever. I'm sure I'm not saying this quite right. Like, for example, if, sometimes if you go to a peer grief group often has those kind of normal grief tasks, if you will, like the tasks,
like the good coping skills.
Yeah, and the healthy integrating of your story and your loss and your grief into your life, and figuring out how you're going to integrate the memories of that person and carry that forward, and how you're going to remember them. And so that it might involve doing something with a picture and objects and different things, right? Well, if every time you see that picture, it's triggering some kind of PTSD response, then that's interfering with your ability to do these healthy grieving activities and integrations and tasks. And I thought that was so interesting. And so this idea that if there is any element of trauma there, you kind of have to tackle that first. And I'm reading a book. I need to finish it because I think the author would be a good person to interview, but it's all about traumatic grief and like how in a traumatic grief situation, how then what do those next steps look like? How do you begin to unpack and address that? And the other really interesting thing that Lane said that surprised me, because I think that it's easy to guess that there are some causes of loss that might be more traumatic than others. For example, someone murdered your husband. That is, by definition, very traumatic, right? You can imagine that suicide cases, that drug overdose cases, there could be, it seems obvious that there would be trauma involved, and therefore it might be, I don't know, maybe easier to recognize that you need to address the trauma. She said something really interesting, was that for both children and adults, that the cases of suicide and homicide were the most traumatic, whether it's children or adults. But after that, if you take out those cases, then adults were more likely to have a trauma reaction from a sudden loss, like a surprise heart attack, a plane crash, a car crash. A sudden and unexpected loss is more likely to trigger a trauma reaction in an adult. In a kid, it's actually the opposite, that longer, like a lengthy terminal illness is more likely to trigger a trauma response in a kid than those sudden losses. And I thought that was fascinating. And I think part of it, because that was not obvious to me at all, right? This idea that, because on the one hand, you might think, well, if they were sick for X amount of time, then it was expected, so it must be less traumatic. But
I remember thinking that. And then I walked into a hospice group with a group of people, and it was like, nope, I was totally wrong.
Yeah. Well, and in the case of children specifically, that let's say, well, like in my case, my husband was sick for 8 months. So there was 8 months of quite a bit of turmoil and upheaval and routine disruption. And in some cases, not in my case, but in some cases, like, the parent who's sick and the spouse might have to travel to another city for multiple times or length of time for treatments, advanced trials or things, leaving the children then in the care of relatives or friends or something that's disruptive to the normal family routines and stability, and totally turns their world upside down basically for the period of time that parent is sick. So not only do you have then the loss at the end, but you also have all of that, the different traumatic stuff going on for that period of time. So I thought that was really interesting. It's something I'd like to learn more about, but something I think important to consider when we're thinking about our kids and how they're coping or not coping, and at least being open to consider how they seem to be handling it and whether there might be or might not be any kind of trauma response involved in where they're at right now.
Yeah, I think that would be, I would love to learn more about that because as you mentioned, us being the victim of a homicide, it very much is, I'm wondering, I'm questioning, this Caleb, and I remember my counselor telling me early on, he was 2 when his dad died. So developmentally, he's not really comprehending the storyline.
Right.
They start to develop that part of their brain of a full storyline around kindergarten, 5 or 6. And so, but even then with Caleb, it wasn't very present. He had some moments. So you never really know, like you're gauging, you're like, is this, kind of like you said earlier about where teens are. I think as it pertains to trauma, there's just so much to unpack there. So gosh, you are so lucky to be able to talk to all of these people, but we're lucky to be listeners, right? Because we're sitting on the couch with you. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I feel lucky to be able to talk to these people, and I'm lucky that so many of them are willing to talk, it's been really awesome.
That's so good. So if we're looking forward a year from now, what does that look like for you? Like, what would we be celebrating with you a year from today?
Yes. Well, I hope a lot.
You are busy. We've heard
fingers crossed, knock on wood, and all those good things. No, so I'm working on my first book right now. It's a memoir based on my Caringbridge journal from the time when Dennis was sick. The first draft is done, so that I did that during August. I have put it aside now, and I need to start editing and figuring out my next steps. So hopefully by a year from now, we'll be celebrating the launch of that book. I'm also working on my second book, so the Widowed Parent Handbook, to go along with the Widowed Parent Podcast. And so this one will be more of a informational, the memoir. And actually, I was writing the memoir, I was like, I'm kind of annoyed. Like, I want to start writing the nonfiction book, the informational book. I think that's a little more my style, I don't know. But anyway, I'm basically the interviews that I'm doing are becoming the research for then that book. So I'm kind of at the point of like outlining it and figuring out what gaps I still have so that I can do some additional interviews and, figure out that piece. I also, I would, by this time, if as long as we're going pie in the sky here,
yes,
I'd like to have a TEDx talk done by then.
Oh my gosh, we are going to pray that into fruition. Yes, ma'am.
And I know you have an awesome TEDx talk, which was fantastic. So I will link to that for sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, but I definitely, I'd like to do that, and growing the podcast. I'm approaching 10,000 downloads.
Wow.
And so stay tuned. I hope that soon I can put a little graphic on Instagram that says, woohoo, 10,000 downloads.
Yes. I was thinking about a graphic you should do for all of the locations around the world that are tuning in. That would be fun too.
Oh yeah, that would be fun. That'd be fun.
Yes, yeah, I love that. It's a message we all need to hear. So thank you again for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been my pleasure. And it's, as I say, it's great when I can do something that I'm learning and enjoying, and it's helpful to so many people. And it is so great to hear from people. Sometimes it is hard to keep going. It's a lot of work day in and day out. But when I hear from listeners, some people have written the nicest things about how helpful it's been to them early in their journey or later in their journey, or with this particular struggle or that particular struggle. It helps me keep going to hear that, people actually seem to be benefiting and learning from it. So thank you to all the listeners who've taken the time to write.
Yes, I love it. So speaking of the listeners, let's just ask one quick question. If you could say one thing to a newly widowed parent, what would it be?
Yeah. I don't know if I can limit it to one, but I ask all my guests that question, so I suppose I should.
I was going to say, this is your question, not mine.
I know. I think it would be please don't assume that your kid is just going to bounce back without any kind of support. Oftentimes I hear this notion that kids are resilient, and it's kind of conventional wisdom, and I think sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. And I think that the thing is to figure out, like, is your kid one who's going to be resilient with a small amount of support, or do they need more support? And actually, when I was talking to Lane Pease, she said that sometimes people like to think that kids are like a super ball, bouncy, that bounces right back without really any push. Whereas her analogy was more like a basketball, that they need a push to kind of bounce back, and they need that support. And I think that made a lot of sense. And I guess I would say, it's awfully hard to know, right? But to not just assume that whatever you're seeing is something they're going to grow out of, or that time will fix it. It's always better, I think, to try to err on the side of getting more support and earlier than less support and later. Mm-hmm. And I actually, that recently I talked to Vicki J from the National Alliance for Grieving Children, and she said it really well. I think it's always better to support a grieving child than it is to deal with potentially a broken adult later.
So true.
And I thought that was a really good synopsis of why I'm doing this and why I think the topic is so important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm with you on that. Well, where can listeners find more about your work, and where can they stay tuned about the books that are coming out?
Yes. Well, my website would be the best place for one, jennylisk.com, JENNYLISK, or widowedparentpodcast.com also takes you to the same place. And actually I've got people can put their email address and stay in the loop to hear about the books. But also I've got, a couple of different documents that I think might be helpful. One is what I've learned about widowed parenting, and I put together kind of the top 10 things I've learned from my guests so far. It's obviously a work in progress, right? Because every time I talk to somebody, I learn something else. But that is it's a free download, and I put that together. So jennylisk.com/top10 is where you can get that, and then brand new, just available. So at jennylisk.com/allies. I've put together a guide for the allies of widowed families. So the family, the friends, the colleagues, the neighbors, the people who want to help. I mean, if you're anything like me, I get questions all the time because people know about my journey, your journey, right? How do I help my friend whose husband just died? How do I help my colleague whose wife just died and they have these 3 kids? And so this guide is meant to be helpful to those allies of how they can support widowed families.
So good.
So that's available too. And I'm on social media at Lisk Jenny. So you can find me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook on that. And please do connect, because I would love to hear from everybody.
Yes, we love to be social.
Yes, for sure. And so I don't want to let you get away here without asking you.
So see how we just turn the tables like that? That's fast.
Yes, right. So I get my microphone back now. I get to be the host. What do you have going on that listeners might be interested in knowing about?
Oh man, so many good things. I'm in a writing hole also, working on my first book, Stop and Shift, which is all about reframing your thoughts so you can renew your mind. Because if I looked back at my journey, that's what it was, right? It was my mindset that helped me to pick intentional choices and build habits that were going to help me heal. All about mindset. That's where it starts. So I'm excited about that. I'm working on that.
I can't wait to read it. I want to be one of your early readers.
You will be. I am writing that down right now.
Yeah, put me on your list.
Yes. And honestly, just a lot of traveling coming up in 2020. I do a lot of speaking. And so I'll be over there on the West Coast for a little bit.
Coming to Seattle?
I'll be in Portland, so I need to work on Seattle, find something there. But
I have quite a few listeners in Oregon, so
fantastic, great. So, and it's so fun, right? Because to your point, to engage with people and then get energy from that engagement, even though I'm showing up and working, to walk away feeling energetic, is really, really nice. So yeah, just spreading a lot of conversation about mental health. And it's not just mental illness, it's also mental strength training. I want people to have the tools to build a healthy mindset. So I'm staying busy. You know the drill.
Yes, for sure. Good. Well, and so where can listeners find you?
Yep, they can find me at my website. You can find anything there, KarenMillsap.com, Millsap with 2 L's. And I also love being social. So if you look up Karen Millsap, you will find me on Instagram and Facebook are my favorite platforms.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for guest hosting on my show today and last week, and for helping me celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the Widowed Parent Podcast. It's been so much fun talking to you. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Well, I have to say congratulations. I remember when we first talked about this and when you got it up and running, and I just knew it was going to be something special. And our circles have actually crossed a couple of times. You know, I'll talk to somebody else when I'm going to do a podcast. They're like, do you know Jenny Lisk? You should talk to her. I'm like, I knew her before you knew her. So thank you for having the courage to put this out there.
Yeah, actually somebody recently said the same thing to me. Oh, you should interview Karen Millsap. And I was like, hey, I already did.
We're friends in real life.
Exactly. Yeah, that's awesome. Good. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks. Keep doing the good work, Jenny.
Thank you. And same to you. I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Karen Millsap as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 46. Hey, a little bit of a look ahead here. So coming up next week, we've got a discussion on grief and the holidays with Cara, which is an organization in Palo Alto in the Bay Area in California. So do check that out if that's a topic that's of interest to you, or if you are local to Palo Alto or that area and are interested in learning more about the programs they offer. Also coming up, we'll have a discussion with Claire Bidwell-Smith about anxiety and grief. She's written an excellent book on this topic, so I am looking forward to talking with her. Probably running in January will be my interviews with Aluna and the Dougie Center. Aluna actually being here in Seattle, but a nationwide organization, and the Dougie Center being in Portland, Oregon. Also some terrific discussions with women who lost parents when they were kids, and their reflections and their journeys, and a number of other ones too. So stay tuned over the coming weeks and months. We got lots of good stuff ahead. Again, huge thanks to Karen Millsap for interviewing me this week. So much fun talking to her, and I'm so glad that she was able to do that. And big thanks to all of my listeners. Very excited to say now, as of a few days ago, we have 10,000 downloads of the podcast, which is a huge milestone, and one that I was thinking it might be too much to hope to get to 10,000 by the 1-year anniversary. But things worked out nicely, and made it just about with 4 days to spare, I think. So anyway, thank you to those of you who've been listening and sharing, especially. Sharing is a great way to let other people know about the podcast. And so I hope you'll share some of your favorite episodes. And another actually really important way to get the word out about the podcast is iTunes reviews, which, of course, it's always nice to hear what people have to say about the podcast. And also, it is actually important, not just for that reason, but also the more reviews and ratings there are, the easier it is for people to find it, and for other widowed parents to become listeners and to learn from all the guests and the interviews here. So I hope you'll take a moment and leave a quick iTunes review. It doesn't have to be long, just a few comments about the show, and then there's a quick star rating that's easy to do as well. So I hope you'll take a moment and do that. All right. Hey, so thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.